Alright, today I'm going to try to show you a little bit about paper piecing. With paper piecing, you need several tools. First of all, you need a paper to use for your foundation that's very light, thin, so it will tear away easily. You also need a pattern, and today we're going to do the Agape Heart pattern, and I just want to show you, you can print it out from the PDF, and you can print it out in different sizes. This one of these is a little larger than the other, and today I'm using the smaller heart because it takes less size pieces of fabric. You need to find fabric that you think would go from maybe light to dark. See, I have a very dark here and I have a very light, and you need to find a background fabric, something very light. This is a very light kind of sky blue fabric, but I could also use white. You need your tools, you need your pattern, as I said, which is printed out onto this thin paper, and you need to cut down the middle right here. Now notice this does not show a seam allowance, so when you're putting on your fabric, be sure that you're letting your fabric overlap enough that it will give a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's one thing I really not crazy about this pattern. But you need to cut your pattern pieces in half because you're going to work on 1/2 at a time. So the next thing you need are your tools, and you need a glue stick, just a plain old ordinary glue stick that will glue your first piece of fabric down. And I've already glued this because it's kind of hard in a video to do these things, but you can see that this is kind of stuck to the paper, and that'll keep it from moving when you're first starting out. You need some kind of postcard, cardstock paper about the size of a postcard. You need an add 1/4 ruler, and the 6-inch ruler would work okay for this, but I'm finding that this 12-inch ruler works pretty well for anything I do. You need a rotary cutter, and I have this small rotary cutter that I saved just for paper piecing. And a new thing that I learned about last year is a glue pen. And what this glue pen does is it has a tip that's a very light glue. You can raise it up and down, and it will allow you to go along the edge where you're going to add your next 1/4 inch fabric, and you don't have to ever use pins, and it'll hold it in place. For this project also, you need some kind of pencil or instrument excuse me, to draw on fabric for a particular thing. So those are the tools we need. Now the first step, as I said, is to glue your fabric on to the wrong side. When you look at this side, you can see the letters and you can read this, but when you look at the wrong side, you notice that everything's dimmer and backwards. That's the side that you always put your fabric on, the wrong side, and you always sew on the right side. So I've sewn my 1/4 inch right here for this one. My next step for this would be to press, but I want to go back and show you what I did first of all with this piece of fabric. When I glued it on to the wrong side, I just laid it so that it would make sure and cover a 1/4 inch outside and at least a 1/4 inch here. And then the next step would be to fold on the, turn it back right side up after you've glued it in place, and fold on the line for number 1, the line between 1 and 2, and take your postcard and put it up inside to give you a little bit of a ridge. So my postcard is right tucked in tightly along that edge, and that's when you use your 1/4 inch ruler to actually trim off this excess fabric. And you can see I have some excess fabric, so I'm going to trim that down to a 1/4 inch before I sew. Now at this point it's still all loose. All the fabric is loose. When I go to put my, and I didn't show you my, these are my 5 strips that I've cut for one, and see it goes from light to kind of medium. That's kind of a bright, so that's why I put it in the middle, and then dark. And then for my other section of my heart, I didn't know I had this much blue fabric, but I was able to find 5 more uh, blue fabrics. And I don't plan to sew this, so when we next meet, and anybody who wants to try this who doesn't have a big store of fabric, I would be happy for you to take these pieces and make a blue heart if you'd like to do that. So when I took this blue piece, which was my next piece, I put a little bead of this glue along the white and blue striped fabric, just in the 1/4 inch. I don't want it to go over into the fabric that'll show. And then I laid this on top. Let me show you. And that stuck it down so that when I went to the sewing machine to sew on the line, I knew it wouldn't shift. And in the old days, before these glue pens were invented, we just used regular straight pens. And a straight pen is a good idea too. But before you actually glue or sew, it's always a good idea to fold back the fabric and hold it up and make sure that it completely covers that next section. See, section 2 is going to be completely covered, and I'm actually going to have to trim off quite a bit of fabric right there. And I'll do that same step of folding back this fabric, put my postcard up in there, add my 1/4 inch, add a 1/4 inch ruler, and trim that off before I go and sew in section 3. So you just completely do those same steps over and over again. And I want to show you the right side and the back side of my Agape Heart, where I told you about my ombre fabric. With ombre fabric, you can go from very light to very dark within one length of fabric. And here's the yellow, just to show you how it works. It's pretty dark here. Doesn't look as dark in this light. And then it goes down to almost white. And then it goes back on the opposite side of the fold, back from light to dark. So with ombre fabric, you can take make your square for the lower half of the heart somewhere in here, and when you sew on each side of a drawn diagonal line and cut it apart, you'll have a very light half and you'll have a very dark half. And that's what I did, and you can see it with this yellow. It's not as big of a contrast maybe, but a little bit of a contrast as the dark and the lighter red. And you, of course, do that with your background square. Now, on this blue, I didn't have a blue fabric that was ombre enough to do that with. And so what I did is I took my background square and I cut it on the diagonal. This is just a 7-inch square. Cut it on the diagonal. And then I cut a 7-inch square triangle, not to waste fabric. I just got it on the right angle and cut here. Knowing that it would be a 7-inch square if I did the total thing, and a dark one. And I'm going to put those two together with my background fabric, right sides together, and I'm just going to sew on the hypotenuse. I have to put that in since I was a geometry teacher. I'm going to sew on this longest edge, a 1/4 inch, and when I open it up, I will have kind of a medium triangle, and then when I sew this one, the dark blue, and I open it up, I'll have a dark blue, and that way the lower half of the triangle will have contrast, and that's what you want. You want the lower points to have contrast, and you have to square this up to about measure how wide, including seam allowance, your paper piece triangle is. Now it's going to be longer up and down than it is wide, but this has to be a square in order to make the perfect point. So this square has to be the same dimensions across here and this way of your upper lower edge of your paper piece hearts. So you can measure that before you ever begin if you want to look at your pattern and measure it with one of your rulers, and you'll know exactly how big to make your, be sure to add your 1/4 inch to make your square, and you just use a square up ruler to get that squared up. Now notice on the pattern, number 6 and number 7 are these little places here, and you need to have background squares for them. And number 6, I told you to cut 3-inch squares. On the back, you need to have a diagonal drawn on there. And that's where you need your pencil. And you're going to put that diagonal line right on top of that line, and that way you'll know that it's going to match up. And then do your fold it down on this line. Oh, looked like the video might have jumped there. And then you can trim off this excess with your add a 1/4 ruler. And then when you sew that and do it back, you'll have a nice edge to your heart. And you do the same right here. If you feel a little afraid to try this at home, we do plan to try to work this in, but several people have asked me for some directions, and I will type up these directions as well and send those on to you. So good luck. I hope you have fun with this. Paper piecing is the best.